The winter wind sliced through the trees like a blade forged from ice itself, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the bitter promise of a hard freeze. Alex Rowan trudged through the deepening snow toward his habitat site, a battered lantern swinging from his left hand, its weak flame struggling against the gusts that swept down from the mountain. His boots sank into fresh powder with each step, the cold seeping through the worn leather and into his bones. He had walked this path 1,000 times over the past 3 years, knew every tree, every ridge, every frozen stream that cut through the landscape. But tonight, something felt different, wrong in a way he couldn't name but felt in the pit of his stomach like a stone. The silence pressed against him first. It was the kind of quiet that didn't belong in these woods during winter, when the moose herd should have been bedded down near the timberline, their massive bodies creating warmth pockets in the snow, their breath rising in great plumes of steam that hung in the frozen air like signals of life. But there was nothing. No tracks cutting fresh paths through the white, no low grunts of communication between cows and calves. No heavy shifting of 1,000-pound bodies settling in for the night. Just the wind and the creak of frozen branches, and an emptiness that made Alex's heart tighten with dread. He quickened his pace, the lantern swinging wider arcs as he pushed through a drift that came up past his knees. The trees thinned ahead, opening into the clearing where he had spent 3 seasons building the winter habitat, the shelter that had become a sanctuary for the local moose population during the brutal mountain winters. He had constructed it with his own hands, hauling lumber through snow, driving posts into frozen ground, stringing fencing that would protect without confining. It was his life's work condensed into one small corner of the wilderness, a bridge between human understanding and animal need. He reached the clearing and stopped dead. The shelter was gone. Completely gone, not damaged, not vandalized, but utterly destroyed, flattened to splinters, as if a giant hand had simply pressed down and crushed everything beneath it. The fencing lay twisted and torn, half buried in churned snow. The thermal windbreak walls he had designed to block the worst of the winter storms were nothing but scattered planks. The feeding rails he had built and reinforced over 3 years of trial and error lay in pieces, some driven into the frozen earth like broken bones. Alex stood motionless, the lantern forgotten in his grip, its flame guttering in the wind. His breath came in short, visible bursts as his mind tried to process what his eyes were showing him. 3 years. 3 years of work, of planning, of fighting bureaucracy and weather and his own exhaustion, gone in what looked like a single afternoon of deliberate destruction. And then he saw the stake. It stood in the center of the wreckage like a declaration of war, a bright orange survey stake with letters sloppily spray-painted across its surface, HOA. Beneath the letters, in black marker that had run slightly in the cold, unauthorized structure removed. The words hit him like a physical blow. He read them twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change their meaning. The HOA, the same people who had fought him on permits, who had complained about wildlife attractants, who had sent threatening letters about property values and aesthetic standards. They did this. They had waited until he was away, and they had destroyed everything. Alex whispered through clenched teeth, his voice barely audible over the wind. They didn't. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. They had, and the consequences were already in motion. He forced himself to move, to think past the rage building in his chest. The moose. Where were the moose? He knelt in the churned snow near what had been the shelter's entrance and studied the ground with practiced eyes. Fresh hoofprints emerged from the chaos, big ones, deep ones, pressed into the snow with the weight of panic. He counted the tracks, tracing their patterns, reading the story they told. At least a dozen animals, maybe more, adults and calves mixed together, moving fast, moving scared. The tracks headed downhill, toward the valley, toward the HOA subdivision. Alex's pulse quickened as the full scope of the disaster became clear. Moose weren't aggressive animals by nature. They preferred to avoid conflict, to fade into the forest and wait out danger with the patience of creatures who had survived ice ages. But corner them, starve them, threaten their young, and everything changed. A frightened moose was unpredictable, a desperate one was dangerous, and a whole herd of them, displaced from their winter shelter in the middle of a cold snap, with nowhere else to go? He lifted his head and listened. The wind had shifted, carrying sounds from the valley below. A car alarm, distant and tinny, then another, then something that might have been a scream, torn apart by distance and weather until only its edges remained. Alex ran for his truck. The subdivision appeared through his windshield like a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. Porch lights blazed, cars sat at odd angles in driveways, their alarms creating a discordant symphony of electronic panic. Figures moved between houses, some running, some frozen in place, all of them focused on something Alex couldn't yet see from the road. He skidded to a stop at the entrance and grabbed his winter gear, his mind already calculating approaches, escape routes, the behavioral patterns of stressed ungulates. His phone buzzed. Sarah, probably, watching the chaos unfold through neighborhood security cameras. But he ignored it. There would be time for information later. Right now, people were in danger because someone had made a catastrophically stupid decision. And Alex was the only person within 50 miles who understood how to navigate what was about to happen. Gloria Hatherton found him first. She emerged from between two parked cars like a fury wrapped in terry cloth, her bathrobe billowing behind her, her slippers already soaked through with snow. Her face was twisted into an expression of outrage, so complete it seemed to transcend the absurdity of her situation. A middle-aged woman in nightwear, standing in a blizzard, preparing to deliver a lecture about community standards to a man who had just watched his life's work reduced to splinters. "You!" she shrieked, the word cutting through the wind. "This is your fault. Your animals are destroying our streets." Alex stood his ground as she advanced, snowflakes catching in his beard, his expression deliberately calm. He had learned long ago that matching someone's anger only amplified it, and right now, he needed information more than he needed satisfaction. "They're not mine," he said, his voice level. "They're wild animals, and they're here because the shelter they depended on for winter survival is gone." Gloria's eyes narrowed, but something flickered behind her outrage, a shadow of uncertainty, quickly suppressed. "That structure was unauthorized. It was attracting dangerous wildlife to our community. We had every right." "You destroyed a protected winter habitat during active use." Alex stepped closer, and Gloria retreated half a step despite herself. "That's a federal violation, Mrs. Hatherton. But more importantly, it's left 27 moose with nowhere to go during the coldest week of the year. They're not here because they want to be. They're here because you took away their only option." Pete Granger, the vice president, had appeared behind Gloria, clutching his clipboard like a talisman against evil. He was a soft man, the kind who had spent his entire life avoiding physical labor and confrontation, and the chaos around him had left him pale and sweating despite the cold. "The structure was violating aesthetic conformity standards," he said, his voice cracking. "We filed the proper documentation. We followed procedures." A crash interrupted him. Everyone turned to see a moose, a young bull, probably 2 years old, knock over an entire cluster of mailboxes, letters and packages scattered across the snow like confetti. Pete made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a scream. But Alex wasn't looking at the mailboxes. He was looking past them, toward the main road, where something was moving through the swirling snow. Something big. The ground had begun to vibrate in a rhythm he recognized, the heavy, deliberate footfalls of an animal that had never learned to fear anything because nothing had ever given it reason to. Titan emerged from the white like a ship from fog. He was the largest bull moose Alex had ever seen in 20 years of wildlife work, nearly 7 feet at the shoulder, his antlers spreading wide as a compact car, each tine thick as a man's wrist. His chest was broad enough to stop traffic, which was fitting since he had probably done exactly that on his way here. Steam rose from his nostrils in twin columns, and his dark eyes swept across the subdivision with an intelligence that made Alex's throat tighten. This wasn't just an animal looking for food. This was a patriarch surveying the territory that had displaced his family. Gloria's voice came out small and thin, stripped of its earlier authority. What is that?" "That's Titan," Alex said quietly. "The elder bull, the one who leads the herd, and you just destroyed the place where he's kept his family safe for 6 winters." Titan's gaze found the HOA board. He studied them for a long moment. Gloria in her robe curb, Pete clutching his clipboard, the other members scattered behind cars and hedges. Then he lowered his head by several inches. Alex recognized the posture immediately. It was a warning, the moose equivalent of a drawn weapon. Pete screamed first. The sound broke whatever spell had frozen the others, and suddenly everyone was running. Gloria toward her garage, Pete toward the nearest open door, the rest of the board scattering across lawns and driveways like startled quail. Titan watched them go without pursuit. He wasn't hunting. He was establishing dominance, making sure everyone understood who truly controlled this territory now. Then he began walking forward, his massive body moving with surprising grace, each footfall sending tremors through the frozen ground. Windows rattled in their frames, car alarms that had fallen silent sparked back to life, and behind him, more shapes emerged from the snow, cows and calves and younger bulls, all following their leader into the heart of the neighborhood that had destroyed their home. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with clouds hanging low enough to scrape the treetops. Alex hadn't slept. He had spent the night coordinating with Sheriff Downey to keep residents indoors, tracking the herd's movements through the subdivision, and trying to prevent the kind of panic that turned inconvenience into tragedy. By dawn, an uneasy standoff had developed, the moose occupying the streets and yards like a peaceful army, the residents barricaded behind locked doors, everyone waiting for something to break. Alex found fresh tracks cutting through his property shortly after sunrise. These weren't the scattered prints of confused animals. They were grouped tight, purposeful, the marks of a herd moving with intention. He followed the trail into the trees, his breath misting in the cold air, his instincts humming with warning. The orange survey flags stopped him cold. There were dozens of them, freshly planted in a line that stretched along the ridge above his property. Each one bore the same marking, HOA. Alex crouched beside the nearest flag and pulled it from the frozen ground, studying it like evidence at a crime scene. The paint was fresh, probably applied within the last day or two, which meant someone had been up here even while the moose crisis was unfolding, which meant the habitat destruction wasn't an isolated incident. There was a phase 2. A twig snapped behind him. Alex spun, hand instinctively moving toward the knife on his belt, but it was only Sheriff Downey picking his way through the underbrush. The sheriff was a lean man in his 50s, weathered by decades of mountain winters and small-town politics, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Figured I'd find you up here," Downey said, brushing snow from his jacket. "You're going to want to see what they've filed this morning." He handed Alex a folded document. Official letterhead. County seal. Alex's stomach sank before he even started reading. HOA Board Emergency Wildlife Control Action. The language was bureaucratic, the kind of carefully constructed prose that hid malice behind procedure, but the intent was clear enough. They were requesting county permission to detain or relocate any large wildlife entering the community. Detain or relocate. Translation: harass, chase off, trap, whatever it took to remove the inconvenient consequences of their own actions. "They'd do this," Alex said quietly, "and they'll turn a bad situation into a disaster. Those animals are already stressed. You start chasing them with vehicles, hitting them with lights and noise. Someone's gonna get killed." "That's why I came to warn you." Downey's radio crackled with distant chatter, deputies coordinating, residents complaining, the endless background noise of crisis management. "The board's meeting this afternoon to push this through. If you want to stop it, you've got maybe 6 hours." Before Alex could respond, a sound rolled through the trees. Deep, resonant, unmistakable. A moose call. But not just one. Several voices rising and falling, overlapping, creating a harmony that made the hair on Alex's neck stand up. He had heard moose communicate before, but never like this, never with this kind of coordination. The herd was gathering, preparing for something, and the HOA had no idea what they were about to unleash. The radio call came through just as they reached Alex's truck. Dispatch, barely audible through static. "We've got moose on Birch Lane. Correction, 3 moose. They're charging at vehicles. Residents are in the streets." Downey swore and threw himself into the passenger seat. Alex was already turning the key, the engine roaring to life as he slammed into gear and tore down the forest road. Birch Lane was chaos, condensed into a single suburban block. Cars sat abandoned at crazy angles, doors hanging open, engines still running. Residents sprinted between houses, slipping on ice, screaming warnings that no one could hear over the general pandemonium. A minivan rocked on its suspension as a curious cow moose nudged its rear bumper, apparently fascinated by the baby on board sticker. And in the middle of it all, Gloria Hatherton stood on her front porch in the same robbob from the night before, waving a clipboard and shouting about trespassing violations. Alex would have laughed if the situation wasn't so dangerous. He jumped out before the truck fully stopped, taking in the scene with practiced speed. The moose weren't attacking. That was the crucial detail most people missed. They were agitated, pacing, tossing their heads, snorting clouds of steam. Classic stress behavior. Something had spooked them, and they were looking for an escape route they couldn't find. Then he saw the floodlight tower. It stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a portable industrial unit that the HOA must have installed overnight, bright enough to illuminate a construction site, positioned exactly where the herd had historically crossed during their winter migration, a natural corridor between feeding grounds that generations of moose had used longer than this subdivision had existed. They had blocked the only path out. "They'd disrupted the migration line," Alex said, more to himself than Downey. "The herd came looking for their route and found that instead. Now they're boxed in and they're panicking." Gloria had spotted him from her porch. She stormed down the steps, slippers squelching in the snow, righteous fury overcoming any survival instinct she might have possessed. "You need to control these animals right now. This is private property. They're—" A bull moose stepped out from behind a parked SUV. Not Titan. This was a younger animal, maybe 5 years old, with a long scar across his left shoulder that spoke of past battles. His eyes were wild, rolling, showing white at the edges. His breath came fast and harsh. He had been running, probably for hours, and he had nowhere left to go. The bull locked onto Gloria's movement and lowered his head. Alex moved before conscious thought could slow him down. He crossed the distance between them in a dead sprint, snow spraying from his boots, lungs burning with cold air. Gloria stood frozen, her clipboard raised as if it could deflect 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle. The bull accelerated, hooves churning through the slush, antlers aimed at center mass. Alex hit Gloria at the waist, tackling her sideways just as the bull's antler swept through the space where she had been standing. They tumbled together up the porch steps and through the front door, crashing onto the foyer tile as the bull's momentum carried him past. The siding cracked where his shoulder struck, and then he was gone, wheeling around to rejoin the chaos in the street. Gloria lay on her back, gasping, her bathrobe torn, her carefully maintained composure finally shattered. She stared at the ceiling with eyes that had just confronted mortality for the first time in 62 years of carefully insulated suburban life. She started, but her voice came out as a croak. She swallowed and tried again. You brought them here. This is your fault. Your wildlife obsession. Lady, Alex pushed himself up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder where he had hit the door frame. I'm the one who just saved your life. I'm also the one who spent 3 years building a shelter specifically so those animals would stay in the forest where they belong. You want to blame someone? Try a mirror. He moved to the window and looked out at the street. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. More moose had arrived, emerging from side yards in the tree line beyond, drawn by the distress calls of the animals already trapped in the cul-de-sac. He counted at least 15 now, with more shadows moving in the distance. In the HOA's response to this crisis, the maintenance team was setting up more floodlights. Alex watched in disbelief as workers in orange vests positioned industrial-grade light units along driveways and porches, connecting them to portable generators that coughed and rumbled in the cold. Someone on the board had apparently decided that the solution to panicked moose was overwhelming sensory assault. More light, more noise, more stimulation for animals that were already on the edge of complete breakdown. They're making it worse, he said. Every light they turn on is another alarm bell. Every generator is another threat. They're going to push these animals past the breaking point. Gloria had pulled herself to her feet, clutching the doorframe for support. Her earlier fury had faded into something more complex, fear mixed with the first stirrings of genuine uncertainty. The lights are supposed to deter them. That's what the Wildlife Control Manual said. It came from beyond the neighborhood, near the river bend, where runoff from the HOA's unauthorized snow removal had been pooling for weeks. The ice had finally given way, sending a surge of frigid water through channels that hadn't flowed in decades, and every moose in the area could hear it, the sound of danger, of barriers breaking, of a world becoming suddenly more hostile. The herd began to move, not slowly, not cautiously, but with the sudden urgency of animals fleeing a predator. They came from every direction, the tree line, the side streets, the yards where they had been waiting out the storm. Alex counted 30, then 40, their massive bodies materializing through the snow like ghosts given flesh. They converged on the subdivision, not as individual animals, but as a single organism, driven by instinct and fear and the desperate need to find safety. And they were heading straight for the HOA clubhouse. Alex understood immediately. The clubhouse was the source of the sounds and smells that had disrupted their lives, the generators, the equipment, the chemical tang of diesel and industrial solvents. The herd wasn't thinking in human terms, couldn't understand concepts like property rights or authorized construction. They knew only that this place had hurt them, and they were going to make it stop. Titan led the charge. The great bull hit the clubhouse doors without slowing, his antlers punching through the wood like it was cardboard. The doors exploded inward, and Titan vanished into the building's interior with a dozen other moose following close behind. Alex ran after them, ignoring Downey's shout of warning, ignoring every instinct that told him to stay away from a confined space full of panicked wildlife. Inside, the clubhouse was chaos. Moose moved through the storage areas like wrecking balls, knocking over equipment, crushing supplies, filling the air with the crash of breaking glass and the screech of tearing metal. But even in their destruction, Alex could see the pattern. They weren't attacking randomly, they were targeting specific things. The floodlights stacked in the corner, the generator still dripping with oil, the brush-clearing tractor that had torn apart the winter habitat. Titan found the tractor and stopped. He stood before it for a long moment, steam rising from his flanks, nostrils flaring with each heavy breath. Alex watched from the doorway, barely breathing, as the massive bull hooked his antlers under the tractor's front bumper and began to lift. Metal screamed. Bolts popped loose and pinged off the walls. The tractor rocked onto its side wheels, then kept going, crashing onto its roof with a sound like the end of the world. Oil and diesel began spreading across the floor, mixing with the snow that had blown in through the shattered doors. creating a slick that reflected the emergency lights in rainbow patterns. One of those lights was sparking. Alex saw the danger before anyone else, a generator in the corner, damaged by a glancing blow from a moose shoulder, throwing off sparks that danced across the concrete floor. The sparks landed in a puddle of diesel. The puddle ignited, and suddenly a ribbon of fire was racing across the floor toward a stack of chemical containers, marked with warnings that Alex didn't need to read to understand. "Get back!" he screamed, the words barely audible over the chaos. The fire moved faster than seemed possible, fed by the petroleum products scattered everywhere, climbing the walls and licking at the ceiling. Smoke billowed through the building, adding another layer of terror for the already panicked moose. They wheeled and scrambled, crashing into each other, knocking over more containers, spreading the fire even as they tried to flee. She emerged from the tree line like a force of nature given form, the largest cow moose Alex had ever seen, her body scarred by decades of winters and battles, her presence radiating authority that made even Titan lower his head in deference. She walked through the herd without hurrying, animals parting before her like water around stone, her gaze fixed on the knot of humans standing in the ruins of the clubhouse. Gloria made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a prayer. Pete had already fled, his clipboard abandoned in the snow. Even Downey took a step back, hand drifting toward his holster before he caught Alex's warning look and forced himself to stay still. The matriarch stopped in front of Gloria. The moment stretched into an eternity of falling snow and distant fire and the heavy breathing of exhausted animals. Alex watched the old cow study Gloria with eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom, intelligence certainly, and memory, and something that looked unsettlingly like judgment. She had seen everything: the destruction of the habitat, the chaos of the displacement, the fire and the rescue and the collapse, and now she stood before the woman responsible, waiting. "She wants acknowledgement," Alex said quietly. "She wants you to say it. What you did, what happened because of it." Gloria's face was pale as the snow around her. "I can't. They're just animals. They don't understand." "They understand more than you think, and right now there are cameras everywhere, phones, witnesses. You can lie to a courtroom, Mrs. Hatherton. You can lie to yourself, but you can't lie to her." The matriarch lowered her head until her antlers hovered inches from Gloria's face. Hot breath washed over her, smelling of forest and wild places and the elemental reality of a creature that had survived in these mountains since before Gloria's grandparents were born. Gloria's knees buckled. She collapsed into the snow, tears streaming down her face, and began to speak. It came out in fragments at first, half-finished sentences, excuses that died before they could fully form, the habitual deflections of someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding responsibility. But under the matriarch's patient gaze, the fragments gradually cohered into something resembling truth. "I ordered the habitat cleared. I knew the regulations. I knew what the wildlife officers said. I ignored them because I wanted the property values to increase. I wanted the views. I wanted control over something, anything, in a world that keeps changing in ways I don't understand." She looked up at the matriarch, snow melting on her cheeks, her voice raw. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about what would happen. I didn't think they mattered." The matriarch held her gaze for a long moment. Then she lifted her head, stepped back, and turned to face the forest. A sound rose from her throat, not a roar, not a call, but something in between, something that seemed to resonate with the storm itself. The herd responded immediately, forming up behind her, preparing to move. But before she led them away, the matriarch walked to where Alex stood. She circled him once, her breath warm against his neck, her massive body radiating heat despite the cold. Then she stopped behind him and pressed her forehead gently against his back. Alex stood very still, understanding the significance of the gesture. A wild matriarch acknowledging a protector, a bridge between species built on shared purpose and mutual respect. When she finally stepped away, he felt the loss of her warmth, like the ending of a conversation he hadn't known he was having. The matriarch led the herd toward the tree line. They moved in formation, adults on the outside, calves protected in the center, Titan bringing up the rear with his head high and his eyes watchful. One by one they vanished into the swirling snow, returning to the wild that had shaped them, leaving behind a neighborhood transformed by their passage. The last moose disappeared into the storm. The wind began to die, and in the silence that followed, the real work began. But the residents were alive, every single one of them. They gathered in the cleared street with shovels and work gloves, looking to Gloria with expressions that ranged from anger to uncertainty to something approaching respect. She had been awake all night, making calls, filing reports, beginning the process of dismantling everything she had spent years building. The emergency wildlife control order had been withdrawn. The Phase 2 clearing permits had been canceled. A team of environmental specialists was already en route to assess the damage and begin restoration planning. Gloria stood before her neighbors without her clipboard, without her bathrobe, without any of the armor she had worn for so long. Just a woman who had made terrible choices and was finally ready to make better ones. "We destroyed something that wasn't ours to touch," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke and crying and too many hours without sleep. "We displaced a herd that had used this land for generations. We caused a crisis that could have killed people, and we made it worse at every turn because we were too proud to listen to anyone who told us we were wrong." She paused, looking toward the forest where the moose had disappeared. "That ends today. We're going to rebuild the winter habitat, not the way it was, but better. We're going to restore the migration corridor. We're going to work with the wildlife officers and the environmental agencies and everyone we ignored before. And we're going to do it right this time, because we don't have any more chances to get it wrong." Alex stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the transformation unfold. Sarah had arrived an hour earlier with supplies and volunteers from the Conservation Network, ready to begin the long process of repair. Downey was coordinating with county officials, turning the disaster into documentation that would prevent similar mistakes in the future. Even Pete had emerged from wherever he had been hiding, clipboard in hand but silent for once, following orders instead of giving them. The work began slowly, then gathered momentum as more people arrived and the scope of the project became clear. Fence posts went into frozen ground, windbreak panels took shape, feeding stations were constructed with input from wildlife specialists who understood what the moose actually needed, not what human assumptions dictated. By sunset, the skeleton of a new habitat stood on the ridge above the subdivision, larger than the one that had been destroyed, better positioned, designed to work with the land instead of against it. It would take weeks to complete, months to fully restore, years to heal the trust that had been broken. But it was a beginning. Alex stood at the tree line as the light faded, looking out over the valley where the day's work was winding down. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, large shapes, patient shapes, watching from the safety of the forest. The herd had returned to observe, keeping their distance but making their presence known. The matriarch emerged from the trees and stood silently on the ridge, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked at the new construction, at the humans working together, at Alex standing alone at the boundary between worlds. Then she dipped her head, a small gesture, barely perceptible, but unmistakable in its meaning. Acceptance. Approval. The first fragile thread of restored trust. Gloria appeared beside Alex, wrapped in a proper coat now, her face tired but calm. She looked at the matriarch for a long moment before speaking. "Will they come back? To use the habitat?" "Eventually," Alex said. "Trust takes time to rebuild, but they're watching. They know what we're doing, and they'll remember." "I never thought," she shook her head, "I never thought animals could be so intelligent, organized, capable of holding grudges. Human," she said quietly. "I never thought they could be so human." Alex watched the matriarch turn and fade into the forest, the herd following like shadows dissolving into darkness. The stars were beginning to emerge overhead,
cold and bright and ancient. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've spent so long thinking we're different that we forgot we're all just animals trying to survive. Them, us, everyone. The only difference is they never forgot that we share the same world. We're the ones who needed reminding. The last light faded from the sky. The work crews packed up their tools and headed home. And in the forest above the valley, the moose herds settled into their temporary refuge, waiting for the new habitat to welcome them back. It would be a long winter, but spring would come, as it always did. And when it arrived, the land would remember what had happened here. The destruction and the chaos, yes, but also the repair, the acknowledgement, the hard-won understanding between species that had learned finally to share the same territory. The wild had spoken, and humanity, for once, had listened.